This year I competed in the second edition of the Elite Zwift Games. It consisted of 3 consecutive race weekends, the Sprint, Climb and Epic, which stood as their own championship events whilst also contributing to an overall classification. In 2024 I only took part in the Climb Championship, but this year I competed in all 3. I'll talk about each, but the focus of this video will be the Epic race finale, as that's the only one I actually filmed anything of. There were also community Zwift Games races held throughout the month, but the Elite category required quite stringent qualification, which limited the field to 50 to 70 riders. The headline grabber is that there was indeed prize money on offer, along with the coveted Golden Tron awarded to respective champions. Both the qualification process and race day proceedings involved verification in both equipment and physical capacities. So indoor testing and accumulation of outdoor data were used to help ensure that everyone's trainers were functioning correctly, and also to prove that we were capable of producing certain efforts. We were also required to provide height and weight videos, and on each race day we had to perform a weigh-in video conducted within an hour of the race start. We also had to provide a dual recording via a secondary power source. So my prep in the lead up to Zwift Games was a bit regrettable. Most of my riding throughout the winter had been on the turbo, with the exception of a few weeks spent in France just prior to the games. But my training was mainly just stuff I like doing, which is long thresholdy climby riding. As a result, my power curve looks something like this, which generally works out okay in your standard Zwift race, which have the tendency to be long drawn out efforts. But an elite sprint race? Possibly a different matter. First up was the sprint weekend, which consisted of 2 stages from which the top 5 riders progressed to a showdown to crown the sprint champion. The showdown results had no bearing on overall classification, but finish line and intermediate points from the 2 regular stages did. Stage 1 was on Mercury Madness, which was a flat 10k followed by an intermediate sprint just a few kilometers from the finish. Obviously I can't sprint, don't sprint, rarely lend a muscle fiber to anything over 400 watts. So my plan was to fully commit to an attack straight after the intermediate sprint, with the hope that everyone would be a bit gassed from that sprint and wanting to save their legs for the finish. I forgot to take into account the fact that I too was rather gassed from the sprint, which had actually been quite a drawn out effort, but nonetheless I gave it a go. I never really got much of a gap, and surprise surprise was swarmed 450 meters from the finish, and limped over the line in 40 seconds. Could probably have finished the stage 10 places higher and without putting myself through 4 minutes of hell, but it was worth a try. Well, it probably wasn't, but if After half an hour or so, we were on to stage 2, which was 18 kilometers of rolling terrain, with an intermediate sprint halfway through. None of these rises are as significant as they look, but I tried to attack on one of the more substantial ones, which was very unsuccessful. With a few kilometers to go, a few riders broke away and got a decent gap. The finish was a long drag, slightly in my favour with the positive gradients, so I went early and clawed my way across, and then just tried to hang on to the line. I got past right at the end, so finished second, although I was actually 5th in the overall stage results once the intermediate sprint was taken into account. I was really happy to have got involved and been in the mix. Even though the first stage didn't work out, hopefully I at least played a part in animating the race. So all in all, it was a pretty good opening sprint weekend. The following weekend was the climb stage and championship. Last year's edition was a scratch race, straight up good old Alpe d'Huez, which was fantastic, but unfortunately there were no 37-minute threshold efforts on the menu this year, as we took on another dual race format. First up was the 20km downtown eruption, which finished atop the hilly KOM and had intermediate points on the volcano KOM. Once again, the top 5 riders from combined results of the 2 stages progressed to a climb showdown final, and as finish line points only decreased in single point increments, the intermediate KOM had the potential to have a significant impact on standings. The volcano KOM is extremely draftable, so I tried to be patient and not commit too early, but I wasn't patient enough and essentially provided a nice lead up for everyone. We pressed on over the top as a group of 6, which shortly became 9. And aside from a half-hearted attack, not much happened until the last kilometre. While it was technically a summit finish, the final climb was more of a 90-second sprint, and it unfolded as expected, with me attempting to go long and providing a launch pad for everyone else to unleash their sprints off of. With a 6th place finish, I was going to need both legs and luck in the second race if I wanted a spot in that showdown. I'd have preferred to jump straight into the next race, but we had nearly an hour-long break, throughout which I tried to keep moving. And then we were on to stage 4, London Uprising. With around 350 metres of climbing in the 21 kilometres, it featured an intermediate sprint sandwiched between the two main climbs of Fox and Box Hill. Having points up for grab on a flat sprint versus them being atop the first QOM created an interesting dynamic, as I had to ensure that certain riders ahead of me in the standings didn't get any sprint points. So we had to try and force a selection over the top of Fox Hill. Fox Hill only averages 4%, so it's really difficult to make a mark, but with a bit of teamwork we kicked it hard and whittled it down to a small group. All the intermediate points were swept up by the top 3 riders from stage 1, which meant that there were just 2 or 3 riders I had to finish ahead of in order to make the finals. Yeah, it was all quite confusing. Box Hill finishes on a flat section, and my only focus was on getting that top 5. So I was happy to set a hard pace and just get over the line in 5th, which was enough to qualify me for the showdown. Alright, the showdown for the title of Climb Champion, in the form of a straightforward 5km scratch race up Fox Hill. By this point it was 8:30 PM and I've been pedaling almost non-stop for 3 hours, outrageously overheated and struggling to get food down. I've made it all sound quite breezy, but every race in the Zwift games required some seriously deep digging just to finish in the front group. And I'd been so focused on just getting to the showdown that I hadn't put much thought into the importance of actually starting the race in a good state. Failing to prepare properly is absolutely no excuse, and based on the strength of the other riders, I don't think I would have been competitive even if I were in flying form. But it would have been nice to have been a bit more involved rather than just spectating from beyond the rear. So I'm still a bit embarrassed by my poor showing and failed defense of the climb title. Let's just say that you probably won't catch me rolling around Watopia on my Golden Tron anymore. The third and final weekend was the Epic race, which was just a single 45km scratch race. There were 2 intermediate sprints, but these only contributed to the overall classification and had no bearing on the stage results. The course was another new route specially created for the games, and featured a significant amount of climbing in the second half, with the finish atop the Epic KOM. Our start time was 6:46 PM. I didn't film much throughout the day, but I just did a spin in the morning and then basically adopted this position for a while. Oh, I actually did film one clip. Bicarb? I don't think so. I'll be having some Ovaltine instead. It's nutritious and delicious. What a treat. The fun all kicked off at 5:46, so from here I filmed and submitted my weigh-in video, updated in-game and entered the pens, set up and joined the mandatory Zoom and Discord channel, and then went about making sure all equipment and race necessities were ready to go, and then finally got started warming up. My typically perfunctory warm-up for virtual races tends to consist of just 20 to 30 minutes of pedaling with some random hard bursts thrown in. I started my Garmin and calibrated my power meter, which was serving as my secondary dual recording, adjusted the fans, and choked down a delicious dinner time gel. And then it was nearly time to race. I didn't record an in-game screen capture because I wanted to minimize the potential for any kind of interference, but I've tried to splice together a few different bits, which hopefully works out okay. Like probably most people, I had a nasty shock in my very first Zwift race when everyone went sprinting off the start line, which I've apparently still not recovered from 7 years later, so I tend to go a bit over the top when the banner drops.
What was that? My God, she's off the front. What is going on, Eileen?
Energy wasting is my e-racing specialty. Even though I'm quite experienced by now, I'm incapable of riding the bunch properly. Some things are just like real life. We were expecting things to be fairly calm for about 4 kilometers until we drew close to the first intermediate sprint on Jarvis KOM. Within the Wahoo team, we had individual goals, but we were also helping each other out where we could. My aim was to make it to the hardest, most attritional part of the course in the best state possible, so I wasn't contesting any of the sprints. That wasn't a hard decision to make because I had absolutely no chance of getting any points there anyway. A few early moves made these opening kilometers a lot tougher than expected, especially since it was so early in the race, so everyone was still fresh and twitchy. Java's KOM isn't really a KOM because it's so flat, and I had to do my version of an all-out sprint just to stay in contact with the front of the peloton. I always panic whenever gaps open up because, from past experience, small gaps can become absolutely massive and impossible to close down if you hesitate at the wrong time. So I overdid it a bit going over the top, but of course on this occasion it all came back together. Talking about panicking, I do that a lot in e-races. I spend most races sitting at the front hovering around 4 watts per kilogram, when realistically I could probably be doing less than 2. I think the problem is that a lot of the low-key races I hop into are just for fun or training, so generally I'm not worried about the result, and so I'm quite happy to spend a lot of extra energy, because that's kind of the point of getting in a good workout. But it means I've never really figured out the pack dynamics, so I haven't learned things like the minimum amount of watts I can get away with doing, which definitely came back to bite me throughout the Zwift games. I'm pretty light, so do expect to have a comparably high watts per kilogram, especially on flatter courses, but I could definitely chill out quite a lot more. I made a real effort to do that during this race, and the difference was hugely noticeable, just having those periods where I was doing 3 watts per kilogram rather than constantly pushing hard on the pedals. The race calmed down until we approached the epic KOM reverse. There were no points on offer here, but lots of attacks went off and my heart rate was also going up, as it frequently neared 200 BPM.
Good work.
We had about 10 minutes of gentle descending through the jungle before we hit the meaty part of the course that was likely to define the race. This was the last opportunity to grab some recovery, so following on from the previous week's implosion, I made sure to take on some fluids and a gel. I'd averaged just under 5 watts per kilogram for the first half an hour, and my legs, which had been a bit sluggish at the start, were actually feeling decent. Energy levels were good as well, but my stomach started to feel less so good. I find it difficult to fuel for evening races, as obviously you don't want a full meal sitting in your stomach during a super intense race, but you certainly don't want to be in any kind of deficit. So I tried to just keep snacking in the hours prior to the race. The bodily sensations are never going to be great when you're in a damp shed with a nauseatingly bright screen in front of you and fans blowing stale air in your face anyway, so it's all part of the fun. Taking a look at the fire we were heading into, the course more or less climbed for 8 kilometers. Within this there was a second intermediate sprint on the Mayan mountainside KOM, and then a gradual drag up it to KOM, after which we were to climb the upper portion of the grade. Then there was a descent before the epic KOM reverse, which would see us to the finish. Given the steepness of the grade, we were pretty certain that the peloton would be completely fragmented going over the top, but there were a number of ways that the lead into that could go depending on what tactics were employed by other riders. The Mayan mountainside KOM was another draggy sprint rather than an actual KOM. I was prepared for the intensity to ramp up early, but the bunch stayed relaxed until a few hundred meters before the sprint. I haven't mentioned them, but in each race we were all given a single power-up at the start line. We all got the same one, and for the most part all used them at the same time, as there tended to be notably advantageous places on the course to do so. I'm not hugely enthusiastic about gamification, but for this race we were given the feather power-up, which reduces your weight by 10% for 30 seconds. So it had the potential to have a race-defining influence, and I was trying to cling on to it for as long as possible, ideally so I could use it in one of the final sharp ramps of the race. But there was a lot of racing to survive until then. I made it through the intermediate sprint comfortably enough. It did string out going through the banner, which led to an inevitable moment of panic chasing, but it all came back together as we rolled towards the grade. A few riders escaped off the front, but with such tough terrain ahead and all of the favourites still contained in the main group, I managed to stay calm and resist the urge to try to chase. Here we go swinging round into the start of the climb. Despite taking a convincing butt kicking in all races prior, I held on to the hope that the opportunity to finally race up some steep, more prolonged gradients would work in my favour. I was anticipating attacks from other riders, but tried to stave them off by setting a tough pace from the start. The peloton continued fragmenting, and I thought it was working pretty well as a few of us got a gap and continued riding hard. I was riding right at the limit of what I thought was sustainable, and I was hoping it would settle down a bit, but it turned out that the hard riding hadn't even started. The gradient averaged around 10%, so drafting benefits were negligible anyway, but there's something so soul-destroying about trying to cling onto a wheel while you're deep into the red. I'm very used to this sort of physical effort, but for the type of riding I normally do, it's almost always a solo endeavour, so there's a sense of control about it because you can kind of dictate your level of suffering. But being at the mercy of others always just feels way harder because you don't know if they're going to crank it up a notch again. Especially when it's virtual, because you have no sense of how hard the other riders are actually trying when you can just see their emotionless avatars cruising along. It's a bit hard to see, but Kate and Gabby got a few seconds up on me, and I'm that avatar dangling in the background, heading towards the dreaded no man's land. I was really wary of the danger of overdoing it while trying to stay with them and risk blowing up, so I was just trying to pace myself. But in hindsight, I'm not sure it was the best move because once the gap grew, it didn't actually extend much more, so I was just in this horrible isolated spot. So it probably would have been worth investing a bit more initially, but it's easy to say that now, as at the time I thought I was on the brink of blowing up. As you can see, I was in quite some difficulty, but it was vital to get over the top of the grade with them if I hoped to be in any way competitive at the finish. Trying to claw back the gap was a super slow motion affair, and every time I thought I'd made it, the wheels drifted away again. The temptation to use the feather power up was huge, but I managed to make contact and just barely crested the hill with the leaders. We'd got up there in just under 6 minutes at an average of around 6.4 watts per kilogram, and considering we were already deep into a tough race, it was quite horrific and I was just happy to be there. We had roughly 8 minutes before hitting the final climb. Although most of this was descending, it wasn't quite as breezy as I'd hoped and required a fair amount of pedaling due to the recent in-game change that only allows the rider at the very front to aero tug.
See what you said in February. Probably we can.
It also featured some reassuring words of positivity such as
acid in my throat. They're gonna beat me. I feel well over my limit. They're gonna beat me. I feel better than I felt all race.
oh, hang on, that actually was positive. Monumental agony aside, I actually wasn't feeling too bad. Obviously tired, but nothing like the cracked state I had fallen into the previous weekend. At this point I was quite happy for a spot on the podium, but another rider had caught back on near the bottom of the main descent, and we approached the final climb as a group of 4. We were joining the epic KOM reverse from the bypass intersection, so we faced roughly 5 kilometers at 6%. The ascent is much less straightforward than it sounds as it contains a few mini descents, so the climbing sections are usually around 9 to 10%. The final couple hundred meters also flattened off significantly, so basically I was guaranteed a 4th place finish if the 4 of us were still together by then. It's pretty obvious by now that I was a few notches off the standard of the best riders in these games, but this final climb was to be the longest we had faced yet, so I was still going to give it a shot for the win. My best hope was to draw out the effort for as long as possible, so my plan was to kind of just ignore everyone and keep the pace hard for the entire climb. Even if I wasn't able to get away, I hoped to at least whistle it down to guarantee a top 3 finish. It can be demoralizing when you make a move and get absolutely nowhere. The instinct is to kind of give up, but as I mentioned previously, you really have no way to gauge how much the others are suffering. For all you know, they could be on the verge of blowing up, so sometimes you just have to ignore everything and continue plugging away for a bit, even if you think it's not working. Maria kept losing contact and then catching back on, but despite my best efforts, there was no shaking Gabby and Kate. This Zwift Games finale really brought home just how high the standards of esports currently is. Zwift racing has always been incredibly difficult, going back to the first elite level races I did in 2020, but within the last year or two it's really progressed to a new level. We've seen the emergence of full-time esports athletes primarily through the ability to earn a pretty solid income from race winnings on another e-racing platform, MyWhoosh, provided you're regularly placing well in these races, which is, of course, absurdly hard. But the sport has reached a point where even if you're a really good road cyclist, you can't just hop on the trainer and expect to do well. There's definitely a specific level of training required, and you have to kind of be good at it all. Being a good sprinter isn't enough to win sprint races, and having a good threshold and power to weight climbing ability isn't enough to win climbing races. I had accepted that I wasn't going to be flying away solo, but I really wanted that top 3, so I was happy to just sit on the front, keeping a high pace. Maria caught back on just before the start of the final steep pitch, and this was my last ditch attempt, so I threw everything into it and finally deployed the feather power up. You might have noticed that I've been doing quite a lot of standing up pedal mashing in this race, but when I get really tired I always resort to going all hunched over and riding in the drops. Closing up the airways is exactly what you don't want to be doing, but it always seems to happen when I can't be bothered to hold up my body weight anymore. So that was my last attempt, and when Gabby then made her move, I never stood a chance. My avatar is out of shot, but you can see from the live positions that the 4 of us blew apart and I was doing all I could to hold on for 3rd place. Probably there are things I could have done to improve my performance in this race in terms of general preparation and conserving energy within the race, but realistically I wasn't close to the standard required to win this. I just can't do like 10 watts per kilogram for a minute off the back of doing 6 watts per kilogram for 10 minutes off the back of doing 5 watts per kilogram for an hour. When we got to the flatter section, Maria started closing in on me, and I had this horrible vision of getting past right before the line. The thought of all that suffering going to waste forced my legs around, and those last 30 seconds were genuinely some of the most painful of my cycling career. Not career, cycling hobby. So I did hang on to 3rd, which I was surprisingly incredibly happy with. It was a very rare instance where I finished the race feeling like it was the best I had, which was a long way off the win, but that's cool. I also moved up to 9th on GC where I was in great company with my Wahoo teammates. It was awesome to support each other throughout the games, so a huge thank you to them and also our DSs Adam and Stefan. So that was my experience of the Elite Zwift Games 2025. I knew it was going to be tough, but it somehow still managed to surpass all expectations. Maybe I should have done more tailored training in the months before, because it certainly was a shock to the system, but I also don't really regret it and probably wouldn't have done anything differently. And most importantly, I had a lot of fun, which is what it's all about.
I was screaming, I don't try so hard, my life. It's terrible, I was gonna black out.